We'll go ahead and be turning to the book of Acts. We'll be turning to the book of Acts, chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. Acts 27, we'll be starting there in just a moment in Acts chapter 27. Before we do, we want to remind ourselves of the outline of the book that we're following, and then we will get into chapter 27 itself after the outline, a quick review of what's leading up, the events leading up to chapter 27, where Paul is journeying to Rome. A couple of things to note again before we get started. As we've been noting, we're quickly coming to the end of the book of Acts. We have just 2 chapters left, 2 lessons left in our workbook as well. That's 25 and 26. And so, if you haven't already, if you would go ahead and pick up the material for Romans. We're a couple of weeks away. I'll explain why in a second. But we'll be getting to the book of Romans here rather quickly. And so, if you would go ahead, there are these blue folders up here that's got the outlines and class and the outlines and questions for each of the 16 chapters, as well as an introductory lesson in there as well. We're a couple of weeks away because we'll be going out of town tomorrow morning, and we'll be gone for a week. And so Wednesday will be a singing night, and then I believe Mike Starkey's going to teach the class on Sunday over a topic that he's chosen to speak to you. So we'll pick up in Acts, Lord willing, not this Wednesday, but the next Wednesday, either in 27 if we don't finish, or going over chapter 28. So that's why we're a couple of weeks away. But if you do still, if you would still go ahead and pick up your material for the book of Romans. We'll be there before you know it. We're in the part of Acts where things start to move a little bit quicker as we're dealing less with the sermons preached and more with this more historical narrative. It's all historical reports of the early church, but more so here, such as chapter 27. So we're moving rather quickly through this last section, much more than we were through some of those sort of mid-sections during the preaching journeys of Paul. So if you want to go ahead and pick that up, we'll be there shortly. The book of Acts now, it divides itself down into 2 major sections that we've been following throughout the time we've been studying the book. Those 2 sections are the Gospel in Palestine in 1 to 12, and the Gospel of the uttermost parts of the world in 13 through 28. So, as we've been noting for quite a while now, we're in that final section of the book of Acts, where we are dealing with the Gospel to the uttermost parts of the world. That encompasses the 3 preaching or missionary journeys, as they're often referred to, of the Apostle Paul, as well as his journey to Rome, which we're going to see the first part of here in chapter 27. The reason that Paul is going to Rome is because of the uproar caused by the Jews back in chapter 21 when he came to Jerusalem. So we've been reminding ourselves, Paul came to Jerusalem. There was some misunderstanding by some Jewish converts. Some of those who had obeyed the gospel that said Paul thought Paul was saying you could not keep, not that you didn't have to keep, but you could not keep the customs of the law of Moses. So again, not that he was saying you couldn't keep, nor was it that he was saying you couldn't bind. They agreed you couldn't bind. They thought he was saying you just couldn't keep. Not that it was a requirement. Not that he wasn't saying it was required, because they knew it wasn't required. So Paul was going to take a vow with some men, taking a vow, and go with them to the temple when they paid the price of their purification. Paul goes with them to show to the Jews that he does believe he can keep the customs of the old law. It's while he's there that there's an uproar caused, not by the Jewish Christians. As we've been noting, some of those complaints raised by the Jews from Asia sound very similar to the misunderstanding by the Jewish converts, but it wasn't the Jewish converts or Christians that raised those accusations against Paul. It was Jews from Asia that raised those accusations against Paul in chapter 21 when he was in the temple. And that is, he speaks against this place, the temple, his people, the Jews, and Moses, that is the law of Moses. Those were the accusations made, as well that he brought a Gentile into the temple. It caused a great uproar. The people were probably would have beat him to death if not for the tribune who comes and spares Paul and takes him away. Paul addresses in chapter 22 the Jewish people. The people listened to him until he said God sent him to the Gentiles. And then at that point, he went from somebody they were willing to listen to somebody that didn't even deserve to live. Because he said that God said he should preach to the Gentiles. And so it caused a great uproar. They again would have torn him to pieces if not for the fact that the tribune took him into the barracks and was going to flog him until he found out he was a Roman citizen. So he decides to take him before the Sanhedrin Council, the leadership of the Jews. It's before the Sanhedrin that Paul realizes he's not going to get a fair trial from them. They've already passed judgment on him before he's ever given a defense. And so Paul points out that with hope of the resurrection of the dead that I stand here before you. Well, the Pharisees didn't have to defend him because they believed in the resurrection from the dead. And the Sadducees did not. It split the council. It became violent to the point the tribune has to pull him out. That's right, the 33 pieces. So then, some Jews try to get the Sanhedrin to call Paul back before them. And while they're going to call him before him, they're going to ambush him on his way and kill him. But then he finds out Paul's the tribune. They send a letter. Paul gets sent to Felix at the end of chapter 23. Excuse me, chapter 24. Paul stands before Felix. The Jews give a terrible case that probably no judge would have ever even let get to trial in today's court system. It was such a joke when they hear it. The accusations had no base. They had no evidence. Paul points that out. All they were trying to do was flatter Felix and hope he would rule in their favor. He doesn't. But it doesn't rule in Paul's favor either. He just leaves him in prison and doesn't make a decision. He says, we'll wait for the tribune. But then he still doesn't make a decision, hoping Paul will give him some money. That's where at the end of the chapter we find out Felix trembled and was alarmed when he heard the truth and about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come. But he did not obey the gospel. He's replaced by a man by the name of Porcius Festus. Festus is the new governor. Paul stands before him. Well, the Jews first try to get to Festus while he's in Jerusalem. He says, go to Caesarea. They go to Caesarea. They lay out their case. Festus says, there's really nothing here. In fact, it's not at all what I would have thought that this case was about. It's a dispute about a man named Jesus. And the Jews say he's dead, and Paul affirms he's alive. And that's what this dispute is about. And so Agrippa's passing through, is there, and Festus asks Agrippa, hey, lays it out before him. And it's then that Festus talks to Agrippa, and Agrippa says, let me hear him. So he hears him, and in listening to him, he realizes that he's done nothing deserving of death or even prison. After Agrippa listens to him in chapter 26, the conclusion was he would have been set free, except back when Festus was trying, he had appealed to Caesar, his right as a Roman citizen. And so he's appealed to Caesar, so he must go to Caesar. That's where 27 takes place now. This is the journey to Rome from Caesarea. So we're up here at Caesarea, a little northwest of Jerusalem, where the red dot is on the screen. So they're going to journey on through here for some time. And when this chapter ends, we're going to find them all the way over here at Malta. They don't make it to Rome because of the shipwreck here at 27 just yet. They make it later to Rome. So the journey that we're following in this chapter is from here, Caesarea, along this line, on through and down until we get to the area of Malta. And that's where we leave off here at the end of this chapter. So that's where we're going to be. Two main sections. We're going to have the journey from Caesarea to Fair Havens in 1 through 12. And then when they leave Fair Havens, they journey, was supposed to be from Fair Havens to Rome, but because of the storm, they end up in Malta, again, where this chapter is going to leave off. So first section is first 12 verses, and then from Fair Havens, that's Caesarea to Fair Havens to Malta is 13 through 44, because that's where the shipwreck occurs. We'll subdivide that down more when we get there. Let's begin in verse 1. Let's read 1 through 12 from Caesarea to Fair Havens. And then after we read this section, we'll come back and quickly hit some things here. We'll spend most of our time in the latter half of chapter 27, dealing with the shipwreck. Beginning in verse 1 now. And when it was decided decided that we should sail for Italy. They delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the name of Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put into Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea, along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete of Salmon. Under the Crete of Salmon, coasting along with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lacia. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said, and because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, the harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So, the first 8 verses is dealing with the way they traveled from Caesarea to Sidon, and then they sailed over Cyprus to Myra, and then sailed to Cnidus, under Crete, to Fair Havens. The reason they're sailing over or under these places is because of the direction of the winds. This would be the safer direction to travel. So they go over Cyprus because that's going to help with the winds against them. But they go under Crete because, again, it's going to be the best case because of how the winds are blowing. A couple of things I want to note here in the book. If you go to page 160, page 160, 159, starting at the bottom of 159 and on 160. We'll read the 2 paragraphs there real quick. Paul had appealed to Caesar, so he's being sent to Rome. In this chapter and the next, Paul is traveling from Caesarea, where he has been in prison for 2 years, to Rome, where the book of Acts leaves him in prison. This account of Paul's voyage to Rome is like no other story in all the Bible. In it, the reader's attention is directed not to spiritual truths and acts of devotion, but rather to such mundane things like ships and seas, winds and waves, islands, towns, and harbors. Altogether, Luke has given a description of first-century ships and seamanship surpassing anything else in extent Greek and Roman literature. A fascinating story of adventure. It stands also as a descriptive masterpiece. That's what Garth L. Rees, that's a quote from Garth L. Rees, that paragraph there, in his material on Acts, page 890. So, it is unique. It's a little bit different than a lot of what we read in, particularly the New Testament, where we're focused right now on Paul's preaching, because Paul's been in prison, he's not giving a defense right now, he's on a journey to Rome, but it is filling in some information for us. Because if we jump straight from Paul's appeal to Caesar, Paul's in Rome, there's a journey that takes place, a lot that takes place on that journey. That chapter 27 and the first part of 28 fill in those blanks for us on exactly what happened. A couple interesting things to know. If you remember, in the book of 2 Corinthians, chapter 11, 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 25, Paul said, 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked. Those 3 times he was shipwrecked, by the way, 2 Corinthians is written prior to this. So, those 3 times Paul was shipwrecked that he mentioned in 2 Corinthians 11 were 3 times prior to this one. So this is at least the 4th shipwreck that Paul had been part of. Probably what Paul was very familiar with what exactly was going to happen out there on the sea and the direction when he's saying, listen, it's not a good idea. Paul's already been part of 3 shipwrecks. So Paul had been spending a lot of time journeying by sea up to this point. The fact that he had 3 shipwrecks and some of the things Acts tells us before tells us he spent a lot of time at sea. Because it wasn't like today where if you were in Jerusalem and you wanted to get to Rome, or you wanted to go talk to the church at Corinth, you just get on a plane and fly over there and you'd be there in a matter of no time. But they couldn't do that. They either had to journey on land by foot or on a horse or a donkey. They couldn't just get in a car and start up the engine and take off and be there quickly, and then they couldn't just get on a plane and fly. Right? If Paul was a prisoner today, they'd have a prison transport plane, and they would load all these prisoners on the plane, they'd have a bunch of guards on the plane, and they would take off, and they would just fly from Caesarea to Rome, and they'd be there no time at all. But they're sailing by ship because that was the way of travel they had back then. So they're journeying by ship all the way to Rome. Again, if you look at page 160, there's that map there of this journey. And so that's why this chapter is unique, because it records this journey in great detail. Not just Paul got on a ship, ship set sail, it crashed at Malta, they got on another ship, and they ended at Rome. But it gives a lot of detail, and that's why it's pointed out in that quote there from Garthel Reese, that Luke gives a description of first century ships, seamanship, surpassing anything else in ancient Greek and Roman literature. So he gives quite a description here of this whole process that's going on. In this process here, they get on the first ship, they journey on the side, they get to Sidon, that's when they sail over Cyprus, Myra, as we've already pointed out. And then in verse 6, while they're there, the centurion finds another ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and puts us on board. So it's not quite, again, like today, where if they were moving prisoners today, you have a specified plane or specified vehicle that's going to transport them. If you were transporting prisoners, which they're transporting not just Paul. Paul, even if people thought he was guilty, he wasn't guilty of being violent. But they were transporting quite a few people with them there, that were prisoners, headed this way. You wouldn't just take a group of prisoners and say, we're going to take a bus and just get a regular bus and put a bunch of people on it, and some of them are prisoners and some of them are just civilians that are headed on. But that's how they journeyed here, where they had to find the ship that was going where they were going. They didn't just have this specified ship to move them that way. They had to find the ships headed that way and hope they could go along. So they got on a ship, they got on part of the way. Now they need to find a way to get the rest of the way. So Alexandria, the centurion, who's guarding Paul and these others taking with him, he has to find another ship now that they're here at Myra. He finds a ship that's setting sail for Italy, so he puts them all on board. And they sail for a number of days till they arrive at Cnidus. And it was there the winds did not allow them to go further, so they sailed under the lee of Crete until they came to the city of Fair Havens. Something interesting to note, they can easily get lost through, just a quick cursory reading. Our workbook points this out as well, is Luke is with Paul at this point on this journey. If you notice, look at verse 7. We sailed slowly. Verse 6, and put us on board. And so as we've noted before, as you read through the book of Acts, there's times that Paul says they, or Luke says they, when referring to Paul and those journeying with him. Then he says we or us. Then he shifts back again to say they. Then he shifts back again to say we. So there's times he's with Paul and times he's not. This is a time that Luke is with Paul. He's with him on the ship as they come through. That's why throughout this language he talks about we, the us, we, so on and so forth.
I just thought that was the other prisoners.
Now, yeah, it has a reference specifically to Luke. The way he writes in the writing there, when he uses that term, it's always referring to him being present in the company that is traveling. Verse 9 now. Since much time had passed, the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over. Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only cargo ship, but also our lives." The fast of verse 9 is a reference to the Day of Atonement. That takes place at the end of September what would be to us the end of September or early October. That means winter's coming. Right, so winter's coming, that's when it got very dangerous to travel by ship. And Paul says, listen, if we set sail right now, it's going to be pretty dangerous. Time to Paul. Right, as they do set out. Paul says, listen, if we just set sail here and we don't take time, because much time has passed, as pointed out, since the beginning of the journey. If we set sail now, it's going to be pretty dangerous, and it will result in loss of the ship, the loss of the cargo, and lives if we're not careful when we set sail now. But the centurion's paying more attention to the pilot of the ship and to the owner of the ship than to Paul, and decides, they say we should be fine to go, so we're going to go. They're not going all the way yet to Rome. The decision was, let's just get to Phoenix, the harbor of Crete. Let's just try to get a little farther and get to Phoenix. Then, if we can get to Phoenix, maybe we can make the rest of the journey after the winter's passed. But let's just try to get a little bit further. That's the plan they have. Well, coming out of the second section from Fair Havens to Malta, the story is very well familiar to us. We know it doesn't quite go as the pilot, the owner of the ship, and the centurion thought it would go. There's a storm at sea. Beginning of verse 13, reading through verse 20. We're not going to read all this at once. We're going to go subsections, 13 to 20. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon, a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land. And when the ship was called and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. So, let's back up for just a second back to the map, to give an idea of what's going on at this point in the journey. If you remember, they stopped at a city called Fair Havens. That's where they were. Fair Havens is near Lacia in Crete. So, Lacia is right here. So, they are right about here when they get on the boat. Now, if you remember going back, they wanted to sail to Phoenix, a harbor of Crete. So, their plan is to in Phoenix, probably somewhere over here. They just try to sail along the shore and get to Phoenix, which again is the harbor of Crete. So, it's the same island. It would have been just quicker to go by boat than it would have been to try to travel with all those prisoners by foot, and they need this boat to get on the Rome. So they get on the boat and say, let's go. So the decision was, let's sail along the island, not too far from shore. If you set out deep to shore, when at this time, or too deep from the shore, you could run into some problems. So the decision was, let's stay close to shore as we sail. But there's this tempestuous wind called the northeaster.
Southeast. South.
It's northeaster in the ESV. It depends on your translation, on which word occurs.
Well, I wonder why you were saying that.
Yeah. It depends. It depends on your translation. The north or the southeaster will depend on your textual basis, on what word occurs. So the ESV. So there's this tempestuous wind that comes and strikes down from the land, and when the ship's caught and couldn't face the wind, they just decided, let's go. We can't fight it. So they're sailing along the island here, and then the wind's catching them to the point that no matter what they do, they can't stop it. So let's just let the wind take us where the wind's going to take us. But there's a problem now. There's a small island called Clauda, or Cauda, depending on your translation. And their thought is, if we get too far off a creek, we may run ashore on this. So they've got to try to navigate around this small island of Clauda here. And so they have to secure the ship's boat and hoist it up on the supports, and then they have to undergird the ship, fearing they could run aground on the Syrtis here as well, or the Syrtis sands. It's the quicksands of the northern shore of Africa. And so you're familiar with quicksand. I don't know, by the way, who decided to call it quicksand. Because
you go down so fast.
well, if you watch the things, they seem like they slowly sink, and then it speeds up at the very end. But their thought is, we'll run across this quicksand area, this area of Syrtis, and so they lower the gear, hoping they can try to avoid hitting that area of quicksand, the Syrtis sand. So let's try to avoid it now. If we stop right there, and that was the end of the story, and they found land safely, that's already quite a journey that they probably didn't plan to set. Well, I know they didn't plan to set one. Because remember, the plan right here was to stay along the creek. They didn't have to avoid Clauda, and they're just going up and down all along this area. So they've already got cost much more than they thought they would. The winds have taken control. They're so strong, there's nothing they can do in fighting against it. So, after they've undergirded the ship, after they've lowered the anchor, they've done everything they can to avoid it, they realize the best thing at this point is, we just need to lighten the ship. Let's jettison the cargo off the ship, and maybe that'll help us. And then they send it overboard. On the third day, they throw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And at this point, they've not seen the sun or the stars for many days. And Luke describes no small tempest lay on us. So all hope of being saved was at last abandoned. At this point, it just didn't seem like they were going to make it to where they thought they were going to make it. In verse 21 then. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood among them and said, Men, you should have listened to me, and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. So the people come and they're panicking. What was going to happen? We've been tossed about. We're giving up all hope. There's no way we're going to make it out. And Paul comes and says, First and foremost, I told you we shouldn't have left Crete. That would have been the smart thing, but we did. He said, but take heart, because no loss of life is going to occur on the ship. Now, we'll learn later on, no loss of life will occur as long as they stay on the ship. Some of them try to flee. But as long as you hear no loss of life will happen, because an angel of God, to whom I belong and to whom I worship, stood before me last night, and he told me that, Paul, you must make your stand before Caesar. Now, a couple of things to note. Paul has already been told, you're going to make it to Rome. Now, according to Luke, at this point, for the people on the ship, all hope has been abandoned of being saved. It seems like there is absolutely no way they're going to make it to any island safely, much less all the way to Italy and to the city of Rome. Paul says, an angel stood before me. A couple of things to learn about that. Paul has already been told he's going to stand there, but at this point, that message that he's going to stand before Caesar is being reaffirmed. Sometimes when things get difficult, we can. And we don't know it all. We know, at least from Luke's standpoint, those with him, they've abandoned hope. Don't know what Paul was thinking at this point. But sometimes, in the midst of difficulties, we may forget a fact that we know to be true. When somebody faces temptation, they may Yet according to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, no temptation overtaking except such as is common to man, and God will provide a way of escape. And we won't be tempted beyond what we're able to bear. Somebody may be in a difficult situation other than that, where there's difficult times come. And perhaps we spend time in prayer, maybe we begin to question. Because what we thought wasn't being answered how we thought it should be answered. Yet we can read God's Word and be encouraged by the reaffirming of a fact we may know that in that moment we may not think of. So we don't know exactly what was going through Paul's mind. But one way or the other, an angel stood before him and said, listen, you're going to make it before Caesar. He had already been told that. But one way or the other, you're going to make it before Caesar. Not only are you going to make it before Caesar, but those who are with you will be preserved. So there was a reaffirming there of what Paul had already done. Yes.
That's where faith comes in. See, sometimes we want to know the answer to everything. We want to know everything, how it's going to play out, all the fine details. And, after Abraham was told that Isaac would be the father of many nations, but then he was going to go up and sacrifice, and he followed through with God. And there's a point there that if we only obey God's commands when we think we can see the outcome or whatever, then what we'll do then, we'll justify disobedience. So, well, the command, you not forsaking the assembling yourself together, the man or son is. Okay, but this is a unique situation here. God apparently didn't know about this situation. So I'll justify disobedience in my mind, not before God, but I'll justify disobedience. So if everything is seen, there's no need for faith, and that's the point. That's when we demonstrate our faith, whenever we don't exactly know all the fine details. And I just think that's so important.
You're right, and even at this point, Paul's just simply told you're going to have before Caesar. The ship's going to be lost, like we say. How exactly, he's not told for sure. The ship will be taken to be on some island. But his response is, I believe God, that it'll be exactly as it's been told to me. We'll stop there again. It'll be this next Wednesday, but the next we'll pick back up in our study here in the book of Acts, back in chapter